What if I told you that one quiet afternoon, one ordinary family, stepped into a nightmare they didn't create but were forced to survive? What if I told you that a little girl's laughter, a mother's hope, a father's dream were shattered in seconds, not by strangers in the dark, but by the very people sworn to protect them? Imagine moving into your first home. Imagine the smell of fresh paint. Your daughter is picking out her room. Your spouse is smiling like hope has finally come true. Imagine believing, truly believing, that this was your chance to build something beautiful. Now imagine red and blue lights exploding across your windows, before your groceries are even unpacked. Officers yelling, weapons drawn, neighbors watching, not in shock, but with satisfaction, as if your presence, your skin, your existence. It was a crime. This is the story of the Coleman family, a story soaked in fear, injustice, and a truth America still struggles to face. A truth that cuts deep, a truth that hurts, a truth we must look at if we ever want to heal. But what the officers didn't know, what the neighbors never imagined, was that the man they tried to break had already walked through fire. They didn't know they were provoking a Delta Force commander. They didn't know they were cracking open history long buried. They didn't know this time the truth would fight back. And when the truth fights, nothing can stop it. Before we begin, pause for just 1 second. Look at where you're watching from. Look at the world around you and ask yourself, how many stories like this never get told? How many families break in silence? How many injustices go unseen because no one pressed record? Here on Racial Truth, we refuse silence. We refuse ignorance. We refuse the easy lie. So if you believe in truth, if you believe in justice, if you believe America can be better than this, hit subscribe right now. Join a community that refuses to look away. Stay until the very end, because this story will change you. Now, take a breath. Brace yourself, because what happened next shocked a nation, and it all began with one family, one house, and one moment that changed everything. Let's begin. New house, old hate. The afternoon sunlight draped itself gently across the quiet streets of Brookdale Heights, a suburb that looked, from a distance, like the picture-perfect promise of the American dream. Manicured lawns, neatly parked cars, bicycles on porches, wind chimes swaying in soft breezes, an entire neighborhood designed to whisper, "You made it. You're safe here." That was what Darius Coleman wanted most, to finally offer his family safety, stability, a life free from the noise and struggle of the cramped apartment they'd left behind. As he pulled his SUV into the driveway of their new house, a two-story Craftsman with white trim and blue shutters, he felt the first flicker of relief loosen something inside his chest. His daughter Lena, 9 years old and endlessly bright, practically bounced out of her booster seat the moment the car stopped. "Daddy, can I really paint my room purple? Like real purple? The kind that looks like outer space?" Her voice, light as spring water, filled the car. Her mother, Monique, turned and laughed softly, brushing the curls away from Lena's forehead. "You can pick any shade you want," Monique told her, "as long as it won't glow in the dark and scare me at night." Lena pouted dramatically, then broke into a grin. "Okay, maybe sparkly purple." Darius smiled as he stepped out, his 6'2" frame casting a long shadow across the driveway. At 41, he carried the strength of a life lived under pressure, a strength earned, not given. His body was broad, solid, powerful. But beneath that armor was a tenderness reserved only for these two people who made every sacrifice worth it. The moment his boots hit the concrete, though, something shifted in his gut, a tightening, a subtle alarm, the same instinct that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. Across the street, a white couple who had been trimming hedges suddenly became fascinated by the soil near their feet. An elderly man walking his golden retriever switched sidewalks without meeting their eyes. Two women pushing strollers stopped whispering only long enough to give the Colemans a lingering once-over before hurrying away. Monique noticed it too. She always had a careful sensitivity to the room, to the world, to the way people looked at her, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with judgment, sometimes with the thinly veiled hostility of those who believed they owned a place more than others did. She stepped closer to Darius, lowering her voice. "Same look we got at the bank," she murmured. "Same look everywhere lately." Darius reached into his pocket and pulled out the deed, the crisp official paper he must have checked 50 times before closing. "We belong here," he said firmly. "This is our home now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His certainty had weight. And yet, even with that weight grounding him, he felt the invisible wall rising all around them, built brick by brick from stares, whispers, and silent accusations. Still, he forced a smile as they began unloading groceries, letting Lena carry the lighter bags, the cereal, the paper towels, a bag full of oranges she insisted on picking herself. "Daddy, can we make fresh juice tonight?" "Of course," he said. "Anything you want tonight. It's our first night in our new house." Their new life, their new beginning. Inside, the house echoed with possibility. Empty rooms waiting to become memories. Bare floors waiting for rugs and furniture. And the rhythms of family life. Lena explored like she was discovering a universe. Testing light switches, opening closet doors, running up and down the stairs until Monique called her back to earth. Darius stood for a moment in the kitchen, watching the sunlight pour through the back windows, imagining Lena doing homework at the table, imagining family dinners, imagining a future finally free from the stress that had followed them for years. But the peace was fragile. Monique slid boxes onto the counter, her hands moving automatically as she organized spices and cereal and canned goods. Yet her jaw was tight, her shoulders tense. She glanced through the window again. "Mrs. Thompson next door," she whispered. "She was watering her plants when we pulled up. The second she saw us..." "She went back inside," Darius finished for her. "Closed all her curtains." They shared a silent understanding. Brookdale Heights wasn't merely surprised to see them. It was offended. Still, they pressed forward, unpacking, settling, hoping. "Daddy," Lena called from the living room. "Can we get a swing set in the backyard? Jenny at school has one with a slide and monkey bars and everything." "We'll see," he answered, letting her excitement warm him again. One step at a time. She twirled in a circle, delighted with the empty space that would soon become her world. Monique leaned against the counter, finally letting the edges of her fear soften. "I just want her to be happy here," she whispered. "I want her to feel welcome." "She will," Darius promised, placing a reassuring hand on the small of her back. His tactical mind, however, was already mapping the house. Entries, exits, blind spots. A habit, a lifetime of danger etched into muscle memory. But here, he told himself, danger shouldn't find them. They kept unpacking until the afternoon light turned golden and warm. The house began to take shape. Plates stacked in cabinets, books on shelves, Lena's stuffed unicorn army claiming strategic territory upstairs. Monique wrapped her arms around Darius's waist. "Remember our first apartment?" she said softly. "That place was so small you had to leave just so I could vacuum." He chuckled. "And the neighbor who practiced trumpet at 2 a.m. "Look how far we've come," she whispered. He pulled out the deed again, running his fingers across the printed names. Darius Coleman, Monique Coleman owners. A family with roots, a family with a future. For a moment, life felt perfect. Then, red and blue lights blasted through the kitchen windows. Sirens, screeching tires. A flash of panic slices through the room. Monique's hand gripped his arm so tightly he felt her nails in his skin. "Darius!" Her voice trembled. He moved toward the window and saw them. 3 police cruisers. 4. 5. Officers spilling out, hands resting on holstered weapons, faces sharp and predatory. Neighbors poured outside, watching, whispering, eyes glowing with a disturbing satisfaction. "Lena!" Monique shouted. "Come downstairs now." Lena appeared at the top of the staircase, her face pale under the pulsing red-blue lights. "Mommy, what's happening?" Darius stepped onto the porch. Monique stood behind him, Lena's hand clutched tightly in hers. The officers lined the lawn like a firing squad. At the front stood Sergeant Brian Daly, tall, stone-faced, eyes cold enough to burn. "Everyone out of the house," he barked. "Now!" This is private property, Darius said evenly. I'm the homeowner. A young officer scoffed. You? Homeowner? That's funny. Another chuckled. Built like a linebacker. Probably here to intimidate the neighborhood. Daly's lip curled. This is a restricted neighborhood, he said. Your kind doesn't belong here. The word kind struck like a slap. The neighbors leaned forward, eager to watch the humiliation unfold. Monique's grip on Darius tightened. I have the deed, Darius said, pulling it from his pocket. Everything is legal. Everything is in order. Daly snatched it, barely glancing before crumpling it in his fist. This is fake. You printed this at home. That's ridiculous, Monique began, but Daly cut her off with a raised hand. Save it. You're trespassing. Lena stepped forward in fear. Please don't yell at my mom. One officer shoved her back. That was the moment the world shifted. The moment a dream began breaking. And the moment a father felt rage, pain, and fear collide inside him like storms gathering strength. A lesson hovered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. In America, a black family's dream can be treated like a crime. But love, dignity, and truth are things no badge can erase. Because even as the officers closed in, even as neighbors watched with hungry eyes, even as the lights carved violent color into the twilight, one thing remained unbroken. This family. And the fight for their place in America had only just begun. When protection becomes a threat, the lawn rippled with shadows cast by flashing red and blue light, turning the Coleman's new home into a stage where every neighbor watched eagerly from the sidelines. Police cruisers lined the street, doors flung open, officers postured with hands hovering dangerously near their holsters, an entire scene choreographed to intimidate. Darius stood tall on the porch steps, even as the cold stare of Sergeant Brian Daly bore into him like a spotlight. This is your last warning, Daly barked. Step off the porch, all of you. Monique's hand trembled against Darius's back. Lena pressed her face into her mother's side, trying to hide from the angry voices, the predatory eyes, the way the officers' bodies leaned forward in anticipation, like they were hungry for the slightest excuse. Darius lifted his chin. This is my home. I am not trespassing. Daly smirked, slow, cruel. You think owning a house makes you somebody? He looked Darius up and down. This neighborhood is for families, not troublemakers. Troublemaker, a word he'd heard enough times in his life to understand what it truly meant. But he stayed calm. My wife and daughter are afraid. You came here with lights blazing for no reason. If you have something to say it respectfully. Daly stepped closer, invading Darius's space. You want respect? The sergeant snorted. Earn it. Show ID. Show proof. Show something. I already did. You destroyed it. Daly crumpled the deed further in his fist, as if crushing Darius's dignity along with it. A ripple of laughter moved through the officers. You're fake, muttered one, the officer with the shaved head and mocking grin. Another added, people like you always think they can bully their way into nice neighborhoods. Monique gasped. Bully? We just moved in. Ma'am, the officer replied, we got a call about suspicious activity. A family unloading items into a house they don't own. That means we investigate. Lena sniffed. Her small voice pierced the tension like a fragile note trembling in the air. We live here, she whispered. We didn't do anything. Daly's eyes flicked to her, cold, irritated, as if even her existence offended him. Kids don't belong in adult conversations, he growled. Darius stepped between them, blocking Daly's line of sight. Keep your voice away from my daughter. For a moment, everything froze. If peace has a boundary, Darius had just placed himself right on the border, refusing to move. The officers exchanged looks, feral, eager. The scent of escalation hung heavy in the air. And then, Daly snapped his fingers. Carter, Lewis, restrain them. They're trespassing. The world exploded. Two officers lunged from the left, another from the right. Before Darius could react, hands grabbed at him. Rough, purposeful, intent on domination rather than lawful procedure. What are you doing? Monique screamed. Lena shrieked as Lewis shoved her aside, sending her stumbling onto the lawn. Stay down, he hissed at the terrified child. Don't touch her, Monique cried. Officer Carter slammed her face down onto the hood of a police cruiser. Her cheek scraped metal. Her breath left her in a broken gasp. "Mommy!" Lena crawled toward her, only for Carter to shove her back with his boot. The crowd of neighbors watched without a single protest. Phones came out, not to help but to record, not to protect but to witness, not to comfort but to consume. A show, a spectacle, someone else's suffering as entertainment. Darius felt two officers pile onto his back, driving him to the concrete so hard his teeth clacked together. A knee dug into the center of his spine, another into his shoulder. His cheek scraped against the rough driveway until the skin split. "Stop resisting," an officer shouted. "I'm not resisting." The sentence cut off as his arm was wrenched behind him, the tendons screaming. "Don't lie," another officer sneered. "It's what you people do best." Darius tasted blood in his mouth, metallic, bitter. But worse than the pain was the sight of Lena weeping, her little hands balled into fists, her world unraveling before her eyes. "Daddy, Daddy, stop! Please stop hurting him!" Her voice split through him like a blade. He fought the instinct to rise, to break free, to throw these men off his back like he had done 1,000 times in training. But he knew. Not yet. Not with Lena standing there. Not with Monique pinned and humiliated against a squad car. But the officers weren't done. Daly approached slowly, deliberately, like a predator savoring the moment. His voice came low and venomous. "Not so tough now, are you? Should have stayed in your place." The last thread snapped. The calm he fought to maintain, crushed. The restraint he'd practiced his entire life, broken. The final boundary of patience, obliterated. Daly didn't know who he was provoking. No one in this neighborhood knew. They saw a large black man. They didn't see the years of service. They didn't see the military discipline. They didn't see the scars from deployments he'd never talk about. They didn't know he had spent half his adult life training men to survive missions most soldiers never return from. They didn't know he was a Delta Force veteran, forged in warfare, and hardened by battles that never made the news. They didn't know he was capable of smashing through them like paper if pushed, and they had pushed, hard. One officer twisted his arm too far. Something in Darius's shoulder popped. Another slammed a knee into his back. A third barked, "Keep him down!" Then Carter, fresh from shoving Lena aside, grabbed Monique by the hair. That was it. Darius surged upward. The two officers on his back flew off as if a bomb had detonated beneath them. One crashed into the shrubs. The other hit the pavement with a choking gasp. Darius's elbow struck the third officer in the jaw so hard that the man collapsed instantly. He was moving now, not like a civilian, not like a frightened homeowner, but like a soldier whose instincts had taken control. Each motion, precise, efficient, devastating. This wasn't rage. This was training. Cold, honed, lethal training. Lewis reached for his taser. Too slow. Darius grabbed his wrist, twisted. Bones cracked. Lewis screamed and dropped like a stone. Carter swung his baton. Darius caught it midair. The expression on Carter's face was a portrait of pure shock. Darius pulled him forward and slammed him into the police cruiser so hard the windshield fractured in a spiderweb pattern. Candy-like crackling filled the air as the glass gave way. Lena screamed. Monique, still pinned but watching, gasped. Neighbors stumbled back, phones shaking in their hands. Daly stepped forward, gun drawn. "Drop the weapon, or I swear." But Darius knew this game. He knew that with half the neighborhood recording, with cameras capturing every breath, Daly wouldn't dare fire. Not yet. He stood, chest rising and falling, knuckles bleeding, face streaked with sweat and dust and humiliation. "You want to shoot me?" Darius asked, voice low, steady, terrifying in its clarity. "In front of my wife? My daughter? With the whole neighborhood watching?" Daly hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Neighbors lifted their phones higher. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Someone else muttered, "What are they doing to that man?" For the first time, Daly's certainty faltered. He tightened his grip on the gun. "On your knees," Daly snapped. "Hands behind your head." Darius considered it, considered surrender, considered the consequences. But then he looked at Lena, crying, trembling, terrified, and at Monique, blood on her lip, her dignity torn open in front of the entire block. Something deeper than anger rose in him, something older, something that had followed black men for generations, something that whispered, "This is why we fight. This is why we stand. This is why we do not bow, not in front of hatred, not in front of cruelty, not in front of an abuse of power masquerading as law." He dropped the baton to the ground. "This isn't over," he said. Daly smiled, ugly, triumphant. "Oh, it's just beginning." For a long moment they stared at each other, two men on opposite sides of justice, power, and humanity. And although only one held a badge that night, only one of them stood with moral authority. The lesson lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. When those meant to protect become the threat, courage becomes a family's only shield, and love becomes its strongest weapon. This night would not end quietly, and the war for truth had only just begun. The soldier beneath the skin. For a moment, the entire neighborhood stood frozen, caught between fear, disbelief, and a dawning understanding that something extraordinary had just happened on a quiet suburban lawn. Officer Carter lay whimpering against the shattered windshield. Briggs clutched his twisted wrist. Two more officers groaned on the ground, and Daly stood alone with his gun trembling ever so slightly. Darius didn't move, not out of fear, out of calculation. Every instinct in him screamed to protect his family, to keep himself between them and the officers still capable of drawing their weapons. Every muscle remembered the 1,000 drills that taught him how to disarm, how to incapacitate, how to kill if necessary. But he was also a father, and Lena was still watching him with tear-filled eyes, small hands gripping Monique's blouse so tightly her knuckles had gone white. In that moment, he wasn't sure which version of himself terrified him more, the warrior or the man forced to reveal it. Daly kept his gun raised, though now his voice had lost its earlier arrogance. "Drop to your knees," he repeated, but there was a tremor beneath the command. Not fear of Darius's body, fear of the truth now visible to every person standing on their porches holding their phones. A neighbor whispered, "Who fights like that?" Another, shakier, "He took down half the squad." Daly heard them. He hated that he heard them. And something darker flickered across his face, fear shifting into anger, then into resentment. A resentment born from knowing that he had misjudged a man completely, that he had struck a match he couldn't control. Still, he pushed forward. "What are you?" Daly spat. Before Darius could answer, Briggs, dragging himself across the grass toward his fallen weapon, looked up at him with a mixture of awe and dread. "You're not normal," Briggs croaked. "Nobody moves like that. What are you, some kind of trained killer?" Darius finally spoke. His voice was steady, measured, bone-deep calm. "I'm a homeowner," he said. "A father. A man who just wanted to move into his new house." He paused, the silence stretching across the lawn like a held breath. "But if you really want to know who I am..." He reached into his back pocket. Every officer flinched, weapons snapping upward in unison. "Stop!" Daly barked, stepping forward. "Hands where I can see them." Darius ignored him. He slowly pulled out a worn leather wallet, opened it, and held up his identification card under the flashing lights so every camera could capture it. A badge. Not of law enforcement, not of the local authority, but of a unit so elite, most civilians only knew the name from myths whispered in war films. Darius Coleman, Commander U.S. Army. 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, Delta Force. Retired gasps rippled through the neighborhood. Whispers rose like a tide. "Oh my God! He's Delta? Those guys are like ghosts." Daly's done. He didn't just pick the wrong house. He picked the wrong soldier. Daly stared at the ID, his jaw tight, his knuckles whitening around the grip of his gun. "That's fake," he said, though he sounded like a man attempting to convince himself. "Anyone can print that." Darius stepped forward only half an inch, enough for the porch light to catch the holographic seal. Daly faltered. Everyone saw it, the moment the truth broke him. Carter groaned from the ground, clutching his ribs. "Sir, he moved as he'd trained for it. This guy, he's the real thing." Briggs swallowed, his voice trembling. "Delta? That's world class. That's, that's special operations. Daly snapped. Shut up! But he couldn't erase what they'd all witnessed, what had been recorded from every angle, what phones were already uploading to social media. The story wouldn't be told in the police report. It wouldn't be shaped by lies written at a desk. It had been captured raw, unfiltered, uncontrolled. Daly's mask slipped. The cold confidence broke into something uglier, panic wrapped in rage. This means nothing, he hissed. You attacked officers. You assaulted law enforcement. You think some fancy ID makes you untouchable? Darius didn't blink. I didn't attack, he said quietly. I defended. Monique's voice rose, shaking but strong. They shoved our daughter. They slammed me into a car. They called us squatters. They destroyed our deed. Daly silenced her with a glare. You people always think the rules don't apply, he sneered. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Sympathy had begun shifting, away from the officers, toward the family they had tried to humiliate. One neighbor, an older white man who had been silent the whole time, spoke up. They didn't resist, he said, voice steady. I saw everything. You went after them for no reason. Another neighbor stepped forward, then another. A woman shouted from her driveway, You assaulted them! We all saw it! Daly's face turned red. He had lost control of the narrative, lost control of the moment, lost control of the lie. His gun wavered, not because he feared for his life, but because he feared the consequences. Darius finally lowered his ID. This ends now, he said softly. No, Daly whispered, rage trembling through him. This ends when I say it ends. The standoff stretched like a wire pulled taut. Monique held tightly to Lena, whispering into her hair. It's going to be okay. Daddy's here. Daddy's got us. Darius didn't let his gaze leave Daly's, but something unexpected shifted. Not in Daly, but in the officers behind him. Lewis, the youngest, took a step back. Carter's grip loosened on his weapon. Briggs stopped crawling toward his fallen gun, because in that moment, they realized what Daly had not. This was not a man to be bullied. This was a man trained to survive the impossible. A man who had already decided he would not die today. Daly swallowed hard. Drop the baton, he demanded, voice cracking. Now! Darius looked at the baton still lying on the ground where he had dropped it earlier. Slowly, deliberately, he nudged it farther away with his foot. Then he raised his empty hands. Daly exhaled, a shaky, triumphant breath. He thought he'd regained control. He hadn't. Not of the moment, not of the story, not the truth. Lena suddenly ran down the steps before Monique could stop her. She threw her arms around Darius's waist, sobbing into his shirt. Please, she cried, don't take my daddy. The officers faltered. Even hardened men looked away. Darius rested a protective hand on her back. Daly, however, only hardened further. Your daddy should have thought about that before attacking officers. He didn't attack you, Lena sobbed. You hurt Mommy. You shoved me. A neighbor yelled, Leave the kid alone. Another added, This is harassment. Daly spun toward the voices, furious. Everyone, stay back. This is official police business. But no one backed up. In fact, people stepped closer. One person recording whispered, This is going viral. Another murmured, The chief is going to lose his mind when he sees this. Daly turned back to Darius, fury and desperation swirling behind his eyes. This isn't over, he hissed. Darius's voice came low. No, he agreed. It's not. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't promising. He was simply telling the truth, a truth that crackled in the air like a warning before a storm, a truth that made every witness feel the magnitude of the moment, a truth born from centuries of injustice and a lifetime of dignity. When a man stands not just for himself, but for his family, for his humanity, there is no force more powerful than his refusal to bow. Daly backed away, gun still drawn, but shaken. The officers regrouped. The crowd murmured. The neighborhood breathed again. But the wound was open. The damage was done. The storm was coming, and nothing, not badges, not lies, not threats, would be able to stop what came next. When truth meets power for nearly a full minute, no one moved. The entire street felt suspended, caught somewhere between outrage and disbelief, fear and awakening. The blue glow of police lights pulsed across the faces of neighbors who had stepped out onto porches, lawns, and driveways. Every phone remained raised, every camera recording, capturing evidence of a truth too painful to ignore. Monique held Lena tight, her arms trembling as if her muscles had finally realized the danger they had endured. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her posture remained unbroken. She looked like a woman who had been forced to swallow fire and now refused to let it burn her from the inside. Darius stood several feet from her, still surrounded by officers, though their formation had faltered. The certainty they entered with had evaporated. Now their eyes darted between their captain, their fallen colleagues, and the man who had quietly revealed he was someone no intimidation tactic could ever tame. And yet, Daly still clung to the illusion of control. He holstered his weapon with a jerky motion, not out of confidence but because the crowd's eyes, sharp, judgmental, and unafraid, forced him. Keeping the gun drawn now would be a public confession of failure. He straightened his posture, clearing his throat loudly enough to reclaim attention. "Mr. Coleman," he began, voice coated with forced civility, "you're going to come with us for questioning. You have resisted law enforcement, inflicted bodily harm on officers, and created a public disturbance." Gasps rose from the crowd. "He defended his family," someone shouted. "That's not resisting. You attacked them," another yelled. Daly ignored them all. He took a single step toward Darius. "Turn around and place your hands behind—" "No!" The words slipped from Darius quietly, almost gently, but it carried the force of a lifetime. Even the cicadas fell silent, as if nature itself leaned in. Daly blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Darius repeated. His voice was steady, unshaken. "My wife and daughter deserve safety, and you won't take me from them under false charges." "False?" Daly snapped, gesturing wildly at his injured officers. "You hospitalized my men." Darius didn't glance at them. He didn't need to. He already knew every move he had made, every strike, every angle. Nothing had been excessive, only necessary. "You escalated without cause," Darius replied. "You entered my property illegally. You assaulted my family. You destroyed our deed. And when I identified myself, you continued threatening me." Daly's jaw twitched. "Your identification, your so-called Delta Force credentials, mean nothing to me." A neighbor let out a bitter laugh. "That's because they prove you messed with the wrong man." Another voice chimed in, louder, angrier. "This is racism, plain and simple." Daly spun toward the crowd. "All of you disperse. This is an active crime scene." "No crime but your—" an older woman yelled from her porch, her voice trembling with conviction. The tension thickened, dense, electric, suffocating. A young officer named Lewis stepped closer to Daly, speaking quietly enough that only those nearest could hear. "Sir, maybe we should call this in. With the cameras and the badge. This could get out of hand." Daly rounded on him. "You questioning my authority, Lewis?" Lewis swallowed hard. "Sir, I said arrest him," Daly shouted, but no one moved. The officers who had been so eager to act earlier now looked at their captain with an emotion foreign to their training. Doubt. They weren't sure who the criminal was anymore. And with the entire neighborhood filming, their hesitation deepened. Daly's face reddened as he realized he was losing both control and his audience. "Fine," he barked. "I'll make the arrest myself." Monique pressed Lena tighter. "Darius," he offered her a reassuring nod. "It's all right. I'm not letting them take me." Daly approached, cuffs in hand. "Last chance. Turn around." Darius stood still, defiant, not as a soldier now but as a father, a man who had been pushed against the wall 1 inch too far. "Captain Daly," he said quietly, "for your sake, step back." It wasn't a threat. It was a plea born from a man who had lived enough violence to recognize when another man was blind to it. Daly swung, not with strategy, not with technique, not with thought. He swung out of humiliation, out of the desperate need to reclaim dominance in front of his subordinates and the growing crowd. Darius didn't strike back. He didn't block. He simply stepped aside. Daly stumbled forward, nearly falling. Laughter erupted from the watching neighbors, a sound that struck his pride harder than any punch could. Humiliated and enraged, Daly lunged again. This time Darius caught his wrist midair, Not forcefully, not violently, but with the effortless precision of someone who had mastered restraint. His voice stayed low enough for only Daly to hear. "I'm done fighting you," he said, "because you're not my enemy." Daly froze. "You're not?" he spat. "Then what do you call this?" "A tragedy in the making," Darius answered. "One you still have the power to stop." Daly's sneer faltered, replaced by something grim and uncertain. Darius released his arm carefully, as though returning a fragile object to its owner. But Daly doubled down, grabbing for his cuffs again. Before he could snap them on, a loud voice cut through the air. "Daly, step away from him!" All heads turned. At the end of the street, a tall black man in a crisp suit strode toward the scene, flanked by another officer. His badge glinted beneath the streetlights. Lieutenant Marcus Holden. Every officer stiffened. Even Daly's posture straightened reflexively. Holden's expression was carved from stone. He took in the fallen officers, the raised phones, the damaged car, the trembling child, the furious mother, and finally Darius. His eyes widened slightly. "You okay, sir?" Holden asked Darius. Darius nodded once. "My family is shaken, but alive." Holden exhaled, tension easing only slightly. Then he turned to Daly. "Reports say this started as a trespassing call," Holden said. "Only it seems the only people trespassing were your men." Daly sputtered. "Lieutenant, I can explain." "No need." Holden raised a hand. "I watched the live stream." Daly went pale. Holden looked him dead in the eyes. "You're done here." Gas rippled through the crowd. "You're relieved of duty pending investigation," Holden said. "All of you," he added, addressing the squad, "drop your weapons and return to your vehicles." Daly's voice came out strangled. You're siding with him? Over your own officers?" Holden stepped closer, lowering his voice but sharpening it into a blade. "I'm siding with the law," he said, "and with common sense. If you hadn't realized it yet, half the city is watching." Daly followed Holden's gaze toward the crowd, where dozens of screens glowed. His face blanched. Holden turned back to Darius. "Mr. Coleman," he said, "I'm deeply sorry for what you and your family experienced tonight. This should never have happened." Monique's voice cracked. "Thank you, but sorry won't undo what they did." Holden nodded solemnly. "You're right, and there will be accountability." Someone in the crowd clapped, then another, and another. Daly stormed toward his vehicle, but not before hissing in Darius's direction. "This isn't over. Men like you always fall eventually." Darius held his gaze. "Men like me, or men like you?" Daly faltered, because for the first time, he couldn't tell the difference between threat and truth. The officers retreated, climbing into their vehicles with defeated shoulders. Briggs limped, Carter clutched his ribs. Lewis looked sick, and the others kept their eyes on the ground. The engines roared to life, yet none pulled away. Holden noticed and ordered, "Go!" One by one, the cruisers rolled down the street. No sirens, no arrogance, no final glare. Just the slow departure of a squad who had lost more than a confrontation. They had lost the illusion that no one would challenge their authority. As the lights faded, neighbors began stepping off porches, approaching Monique and Darius with hesitant kindness. "Are you all right? We saw everything. Your little girl. We're so sorry. You don't deserve this. You handled yourself with such strength." For the first time, Monique didn't shrink away. She stood taller, Lena held close but steady. "Thank you," she murmured to each person. "Thank you for seeing us." Darius finally let out a breath he had been holding since the first officer shoved him. He crouched to Lena's level, brushing away her tears. "You're safe now," he whispered. "Daddy," she rasped, voice shaking. "I was so scared." He kissed her forehead, grief breaking through his mask of control. "I know, baby, but I'll never let anyone hurt you. Ever." Holden stepped forward again. "Mr. and Mrs. Coleman, I'll need full statements tomorrow. Tonight, take care of yourselves, and don't stay in this house alone if you don't feel safe." "We'll be okay," Darius answered. Holden gave a firm nod. "If anything happens, call me directly. No dispatch, no delay." He handed over his card. The neighborhood began to disperse, but the weight of the night lingered like smoke. Darius took Monique's hand. They stood together on their porch, watching as the last cruiser disappeared around the corner. Lena leaned her head against her father's shoulder. Monique whispered, voice trembling with both exhaustion and pride, "They tried to break us, but we're still standing." Darius wrapped his arm around her and looked out at the street that had become a battlefield. "No," he said softly, "we're not just standing." He pulled his family close. "We're rising." The system strikes back. Morning arrived with no mercy. Sunlight crept across the Coleman home like an unwanted guest, spilling through windows still smudged with fingerprints from police who had shoved their way inside the night before. The air felt thick, too heavy for a house that had once been filled with laughter and plans for a fresh start. Darius sat at the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, head bowed. His knuckles ached, stripped raw from the fight. His shoulder throbbed where an officer had kneed him into the ground, grinding bone against concrete. But none of that compared to the deeper ache, the one that settled like an anchor in his chest. Across from him, Monique held a cup of tea she'd barely touched. Her hair was gathered back with trembling hands, hiding the swelling along her jaw where she'd been hit. Lena sat beside her, knees tucked under her chin, eyes still puffy from crying. Their new house, once a dream, now felt more like a wound. "Darius," Monique whispered, her voice stretched thin, "what do we do now?" He looked at her, seeing the exhaustion behind her brave front. "We survive," he said softly. "We stay strong. We don't let them push us out." "But they already tried," she murmured, "and they won't stop." Lena's voice cracked through the silence. "Are they going to come back, Daddy?" Darius swallowed. He wished he could promise no. He wished he could rewrite the world, but he could only offer the truth wrapped in love. "They won't hurt you," he said firmly. "Not while I'm here." Lena nodded, but fear still pulled at her small shoulders. A knock rattled the front door. Monique tensed instantly. "No, don't answer it." But Darius had already risen, checking through the side curtain. A police cruiser. 2 uniformed officers. His blood went cold. The last thing he wanted was another confrontation, but ignoring them would only escalate things. He cracked open the door, just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" The officer in front, Officer Reddick, according to his name tag, held a stack of papers. "Mr. Coleman, you've been served. 6 counts of felony assault on law enforcement, resisting arrest, property destruction, and obstructing a lawful investigation." Monique stood behind Darius now, a hand over her mouth. "You have got to be kidding," she whispered. Darius took the papers slowly. "This is retaliation. You know those charges are fabricated." Reddick lifted a shoulder. "I just deliver them, sir." But his eyes held discomfort. Shame. Even he knew something was wrong. "You have a mandatory arraignment next week," he continued. "You're not to leave the county until then." "That's not lawful," Darius snapped. "It's already in the system," Reddick replied quietly. "There's nothing I can do." System. The word felt like poison. As the officers walked back to their cruiser, Lena whispered from behind the screen door, "They're trying to take you away." Darius turned to her, his heart fracturing. "Not if I can help it." But the truth, heavy, brutal, undeniable, pressed down on him. They were no longer just fighting prejudice. They were fighting a machine. By midday, the news had spread. Every local station replayed a carefully clipped version of the footage, removing the officer's aggression, removing the slurs, removing the brutality. They aired only the portion where Darius fought back, framed by biased commentary. Ex-military man attacks officers during routine check. Unstable veteran endangers neighborhood. Was this homeowner a ticking time bomb? Lena saw comments on her school's group chat, messages from classmates repeating what their parents had heard. "Your dad's dangerous. He beat up cops. You shouldn't even live here. My mom says your whole family lies." She dropped her phone and sobbed into her pillow. Monique tried to comfort her, but even she felt the fractures spreading inside her heart. The world wasn't just misrepresenting them, it was turning against them. Later that afternoon, Monique's phone buzzed. It was the school principal. "Hello, Mrs. Coleman. I'm afraid we need to discuss an urgent matter." Monique's stomach clenched. "What now?" "There have been Complaints from parents, the principal said, voice strained. They claim your classroom behavior has been inappropriate, politically charged, unprofessional. Monique's breath caught. What? That's not even... We're terminating your contract effective immediately, he interrupted. Please do not return to campus except to gather your belongings. Security will accompany you. The line went dead. Monique stared at her phone, her hands trembling violently. They fired me, she whispered. Just like that. Lena clung to her. Mom, they can't do that. You're a good teacher. Tears slid silently down Monique's face. Baby, sometimes people don't care about the truth. Darius stood in the doorway, guilt crushing him like rubble. This was happening because he dared to stand his ground, because he'd refused to bow his head when targeted by hatred, because he'd stayed alive when others wanted him dead or silent. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. Monique looked up, her frustration flashing through her grief. Sorry for what? For protecting us? For refusing to let them break you? They're attacking us because we exist in a place they think we shouldn't. That's not your fault, Darius. But pain still carved deep lines across her face. The day continued unraveling. When Darius stepped outside to take a breath, he was greeted by a horrifying sight. The garage door had been spray-painted overnight. Large black letters dripping with hatred. Go home, outsider. It was still wet, the paint fresh and glistening in the midday light. Lena stood beside him, eyes wide. Why do they keep doing this? Monique answered softly, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and despair. Because hatred doesn't need a reason, it only needs permission. Darius pulled out his phone, photographing the slur, documenting every angle. He wasn't gathering memories. He was collecting ammunition. A police car rolled up as he finished. Daly wasn't inside, thank God, but the officers who stepped out looked all too familiar. Carter and Briggs. They wore smug grins, bandaged from the previous night, but energized by malice. Well, well, Carter drawled. Looks like your house is expressing itself. Briggs snorted. Probably painted it yourself for sympathy. Monique stormed forward before Darius could stop her. Our daughter has to look at this filth every day, she snapped. And you're laughing? Briggs shrugged. Hey, freedom of speech. Freedom doesn't include terrorizing a child, Monique fired back. It does if the child's parents don't belong here, Carter replied with a smirk. Something inside Darius snapped. He stepped closer, his voice low and lethal. Say one more thing about my daughter. But Carter just laughed. Oh? Gonna hit me again? Go ahead, big guy. This time we'll make sure the footage gets out. Monique grabbed Darius's arm. Don't. That's what they want. Carter leaned in, his voice dripping poison. Shame if something happened to that little girl at school. Kids can be cruel. You never know. Darius lunged, but Monique held on with every ounce of strength she had. Don't give them ammunition, she whispered fiercely. Fight smart. He stopped, but the fury didn't. Carter and Briggs sauntered away like men who believed they still owned the world. Darius watched them go, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. The school called again. This time about Lena. A crude drawing had been taped to her locker. A stick figure family, clearly them, hanging from a tree. The rope is drawn in red marker. Teachers found Lena standing frozen in front of it, tears streaming silently. Monique rushed to the school, pulling Lena close the moment she arrived. Oh, baby. Oh, my sweet baby. Darius arrived moments later, fists clenched so tight his nails cut into his palms. This is hate speech, he said, voice shaking with rage. My daughter is being terrorized. What are you going to do about it? The guidance counselor stammered. We're looking into it. Looking into it, Monique echoed bitterly. If she were white, would you still be looking into it? The counselor's silence was answer enough. Lena sobbed harder. Dad, why do they hate us? We didn't do anything wrong. Darius knelt, holding her face gently between his hands. Listen to me. This is not about who you are. This is about their brokenness, their fear, their ignorance. But it still hurts, Lena whispered, and Darius's heart shattered cleanly in two. That night, after Lena finally fell into a restless sleep, Darius and Monique sat at the kitchen table, the house too quiet and too loud at once. We could leave, Monique whispered. Start over somewhere else. Darius stared at the table, the documents accusing him spread out like wounds. If we leave, he said softly, we teach Lena to run from hate instead of challenging it. Monique's eyes filled with tears. I don't care about the lesson, Darius. I care about keeping our daughter alive. He reached across the table, squeezing her hand. I know, but if we run, they win. Not just against us, but against every family that came before us. Every family that didn't have a voice. Every family that still believes this country can be better. Monique looked at him through trembling lashes. Darius, I'm scared. I'm scared of what they'll take from us next. Darius pulled her into his arms, holding her fiercely. They can try, he whispered into her hair, but they will never break us. We're not just fighting for our home. We're fighting for justice, for truth, for every buried voice that deserves to be heard. Outside, a police cruiser rolled slowly past their driveway, headlights sweeping across their windows. Darius watched it without fear. They want a war, he said quietly. But in his voice was no violence. It was resolved, a resolve forged in pain, in purpose, in the unyielding love of a father and husband. They picked the wrong man. The gathering storm night settled over Maple Ridge like a shroud, quiet, heavy, and holding its breath. Inside his small home office, once meant to be a workspace for family projects, now transformed into a war room, Darius Coleman sat before a wall of screens. Each monitor glowed with real-time footage from the cameras he had planted around the house. Every angle, every pathway, every shadow was under surveillance. He had learned long ago that danger didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it crept, silent and deliberate. On one screen, headlights drifted slowly past his house. Another police cruiser, third time in an hour. Darius noted the time in a small notebook. He wasn't documenting for himself. He was documenting for history, because the day would come when someone, somewhere, would need to see all of this laid bare. His phone vibrated. Jorge calling. Darius answered without turning from the screens. You got something? He asked. I got a lot, Jorge replied. Been digging since sunrise. You might want to sit down. I'm already sitting. Okay, brother. Then brace yourself. Darius took a slow breath. Go. The land your house sits on? It wasn't just any church property. It was the church. The one burned down in 64. Darius frowned. I thought the date was 63. Paper says 63. Witness accounts say 64. Either way, you're living on top of a massacre, man, a real one, covered up and buried deep. The words hit like a blow, cold, historical, and horrifying. Darius swiveled toward a bookshelf where he kept a framed photograph Mrs. Jenkins had given him of the church that once stood on their land. Families smiling, children in bright white shirts, a pastor with proud eyes, ghosts of an erased past. Jorge continued, voice tight, as if even he couldn't believe what he'd uncovered. The church wasn't destroyed in rioting like the newspapers claimed. It was torched, strategically, deliberately, and law enforcement was involved. Not just deputies either. The sheriff's department coordinated it with a group of vigilantes. Some are wearing badges, some are wearing hoods. Darius stared at the screens, each showing the quiet street that now sat where dozens of people once worshipped, laughed, and built dreams. What happened to the survivors? Most scattered, Jorge said. Families intimidated, arrested on false charges, pushed out. Some moved north, some disappeared. And the land? That's the real kicker, Jorge said darkly. The city seized it under some bogus urban renewal policy. Then it was sold for almost nothing to shell companies. The same names show up over and over again. City officials, Darius guessed. Bingo. Police unions, too. Developers tied to the mayor's office. Even the police chief has stock in one of the companies. A slow ember of anger lit behind Darius's ribs. So this isn't about me, he murmured. It's not even about us being black in a white suburb. No, Jorge said. It's about protecting a lie built on stolen land and buried bodies. Silence stretched between them, heavy, infuriating, clarifying. Darius rubbed his forehead. Is it just this neighborhood? No, Jorge said. It's the whole district. But your house? Your exact lot? That's ground zero, the heart of the church property. Darius leaned back, stunned. They tried to erase a massacre, then erase the people, then erase the land. And now, Jorge finished, they're trying to erase you for digging it back up. Hours passed with no rest. The soft hum of electronics filled the office as Darius combed through digital archives, property transfers, city council minutes, police reports erased or refiled, census records with names crossed out. The corruption was not new. It was inherited. Generations of carefully hidden crimes disguised as bureaucratic decisions. Outside, the quiet neighborhood slept under the illusion of normalcy. Inside, Darius traced the roots of a system built to keep certain people silent, displaced, or gone. At around 1:14 a.m., the phone rang again. An anonymous number flashed across the screen. Darius hesitated. He knew what an unregistered number meant. He answered anyway. A distorted voice came through, mechanical and devoid of emotion. You have 24 hours, Coleman. Darius stiffened, muscles locking in place. Who is this? He demanded. You don't need a name. You need a warning. Drop your case. Withdraw your accusations. Fire your lawyer. Leave the property. And if I don't, a chilling pause, then your story ends where it started, on stolen ground. The line clicked dead. Darius stared upward, jaw clenched. For years, he had faced war zones made of sand, gunfire, and night vision silhouettes. But this was a different battlefield, built not of weapons, but systems, not with enemies wearing uniforms, but smiles. He pressed both palms against the desk, breathing slowly. Cowards, he whispered. Behind him, something soft shifted, the creak of a familiar foot on wood. He turned to see Monique standing in the doorway, wrapped in a robe, eyes swollen from crying earlier. You didn't sleep, she murmured. Neither did you. She stepped inside, folding her arms against the cold. What did they say? Darius didn't lie to her. They'd survived too much for half-truths. They want us gone, Monique swallowed. They threatened you. They threatened all of us. She closed her eyes, a long breath trembling through her chest. I thought moving here would give Lena a better life, she whispered. Better school, better neighborhoods, better everything. It still can, Darius said gently. But at what cost, Darius? She snapped, her voice breaking. Look at us. Lena is scared. I lost my job. The house is vandalized. The police are circling like wolves. He stepped closer, lifting her chin with gentle fingers. Do you think any of that is your fault? Her lips quivered. No, she whispered. Do you think it's Lena's? No. Then maybe, he said softly, the cost belongs to the people who created this mess, not us. Maybe it's finally time they paid. Monique stared at him, her fear slowly shifting into resolve. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. You won't. He cupped her cheeks. But they will lose something. Their grip, their lies, their silence. She pressed her forehead against his. Then promise me something, she whispered. Promise me you'll come back home alive. Darius breathed deeply, because he couldn't promise what he didn't control. Still, he rested a hand over her heart. I promise, he said quietly. Not because it was guaranteed, because he needed her to believe in tomorrow. A single tear slid down her cheek. The next morning, sunlight barely touched the horizon when Darius received a text from Jorge. Check your email. Urgent. He opened the encrypted message. Inside were documents, dozens, each linking officers, councilmen, developers, and even the police chief to decades of land theft, intimidation, and forced displacement. Jorge had circled a name, Councilman Davidson, primary architect of the redevelopment plans. Another message followed. Your house won a keystone property. If you keep it, they can't move forward. Millions on the line. Darius felt the truth crystallize. Money, legacy, silence. That's why they came for them. Not because he was black, not because he was a veteran, not because he fought back, not even because Daley hated him. It was because he stood on top of a a secret worth killing for. His phone vibrated again, this time with a message from Clarissa. Meeting at 10. Bring everything you have. Doors stay locked. Monique came downstairs moments later, dressed in simple clothes, her expression tired but determined. Where are we going? To the only person in this city who might be able to fight this with us. She nodded, slipping her hand into his. We'll get through this, she whispered. Darius squeezed her hand gently. We already are. The drive downtown was silent, not from fear but from focus. Their daughter slept in the back seat, her face soft and vulnerable. She didn't know yet how much history lived under her feet. When they arrived at Clarissa James's office, small, modest, tucked above a laundromat, they were greeted with urgency. Clarissa ushered them in. You won't believe what I uncovered. Try us, Darius said. Clarissa spread old documents across her desk. Photos, maps, sworn testimonies, censored police files. This wasn't a random attack on the church, she said. It was coordinated by officials still in power today. Their descendants hold office. Their friends run the police department. They've been guarding this secret for 60 years. She pulled another document forward. And your property? She tapped it. The original church building sat almost exactly where your living room is now. Monique gasped softly. So Lena's room stands over the foundation of the old children's chapel, Clarissa finished. Darius went still. He imagined the people who had stood there decades before. Children, mothers, families who believed in a future that the city had robbed from them. Clarissa's voice took on a somber tone. They didn't just try to erase the land, she said. They tried to erase the people who loved it. Darius felt a slow, steady fire burning through his veins. What do we do? He asked. Clarissa gave a thin, fierce smile. We fight back, with truth, with the law, with exposure. I've handled civil rights cases before, but this is historic. Monique looked between them. What about the threats? She whispered. What if they come for us again? Clarissa leaned across the desk. Then that will only strengthen our case. Bullies always reveal themselves when cornered. Darius nodded. Then corner them, he said softly. Hours later, after reviewing documents and strategizing, Darius drove his family home. But as they pulled into the driveway, his stomach tightened. Something was wrong. A rock lay beneath the shattered living room window. Glass glittered on the carpet inside. Darius stepped out slowly. Monique held Lena close. He picked up the rock. Painted in red across its surface was a single word. Get out. A message. A threat. A promise. Darius stood gripping the rock, his fingers stained with red paint, and felt a shift inside him, subtle yet seismic. They weren't just fighting to stay in their home. They were fighting to stay alive. He looked at the shattered window, the broken boundary between sanctuary and threat, and then at his family, hurt, frightened, but unbroken. His jaw set. This isn't the end, he whispered. It's the beginning. Because in every battle there came a moment when a man decided whether to retreat or rise. And Darius Coleman, Delta Force veteran, father, husband, survivor of war abroad and at home, had made his choice. The storm was gathering, and he would face it head on. The fall of the false protectors. The shattered remnants of the evening still clung to the Coleman home like a bruise. Smoke from police flare rounds hung faintly in the air, and the asphalt outside bore fresh scars, bullet holes, blood droplets, and skid marks from the attacker's rushed escape. Inside, the house was unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. Darius stood in the doorway of the living room, bruised, bloodied, and breathing hard. His shirt clung to him where sweat mingled with dust. His fists were still shaking from the fight in the driveway moments earlier. The ambush he'd barely survived. Monique moved quickly to him, her eyes frantic. Oh my God, Darius, your arm, your face. What did they do? Darius cupped her cheek gently despite the pain. I'm all right. I'm alive. But he wasn't all right. He was a man pushed past exhaustion, carrying his family's terror in every heartbeat. Each breath scraped through his lungs like gravel. His ribs were sore, his knuckles split open again. His body had long since shifted into the combat autopilot he thought he'd left behind. He glanced toward the doorway where Lena stood half-hidden, trembling. Seeing her father covered in cuts and bruises carved a fresh wound across her young face. He crouched, ignoring the sharp stab of pain in his side, and gathered her into his arms. "I'm here, baby," he whispered. "You're safe." "But those men," her voice quivered. "They wanted to hurt you." "Let them try," Darius said softly. "They came into the wrong home tonight." Tears welled up in her eyes, not because she doubted him, but because she feared what this war was turning him into. Minutes later, distant sirens grew louder, the red and blue reflections strobing across the broken window. Officers were arriving, late of course, after the danger had already passed, after the attackers had vanished into the night. Monique looked toward the front door. "They won't help us," she whispered. Darius nodded. "No, but we'll let them walk into the mess they created." He stepped forward, his body stiff but his posture steady. He needed to greet them before they invented their own version of what happened. 3 squad cars slid to a stop outside. 6 officers approached cautiously. None of them was Daly's men. New faces, younger, nervous, a sign that the department already sensed the city was watching. A tall black sergeant, Sergeant Wilkes, stepped forward. "Mr. Coleman," he said, voice low, professional. "We got multiple calls from neighbors. They said you were attacked by masked individuals." Darius held Wilkes's gaze. "So you came now? After they're gone?" Wilkes exhaled slowly. "We didn't get any signals from the patrol units assigned to your block." "Because they're in on it," Darius replied coldly. Wilkes didn't argue. Instead, he studied the broken van, still sitting crooked at the end of the driveway, tires shredded from Darius's precision shots. "Did you do all this?" Wilkes asked quietly. Darius said nothing. He didn't need to. Wilkes nodded once, half impressed, half horrified. "Can you give a report?" "I'll give a statement to my lawyer," Darius said. "Everything else is on the camera feeds." Wilkes stiffened. "Your cameras captured the attack?" "All angles," Darius answered, "including audio." That changed something in the sergeant's posture. Hope? No. Fear. Wilkes finally let out a long breath. "Then you need to brace yourself, because once this gets out, the department can't hide behind lost evidence anymore." Darius stepped closer, eyes locked onto the sergeant. "They tried to kill me in my driveway," he said quietly, "with my daughter watching. They beat my wife. They vandalized my home. They framed me. They threatened my child at school." Emotion flickered in Wilkes's eyes. "You're not the first," he said quietly, "but God help them. Maybe you'll be the last." By dawn, the footage had gone viral. Across his social media, millions of viewers watched grainy night vision clips of masked officers in tactical gear storming the Coleman property. They saw the brutality, the ambush, the attempted execution. But they also saw something else. A single man, a veteran, a father, fighting for his life with terrifying precision. News stations played slowed-down clips of Darius disarming attackers in seconds. Analysts called it military-grade response, Delta Force discipline, a masterclass in controlled force. The city woke up shocked. For the first time in years, the police department was no longer feared. It was exposed. At Clarissa James's law office that morning, the atmosphere crackled with intensity. Every local news station wanted a statement. Every civil rights organization was calling. National reporters were requesting interviews. But Clarissa's attention was focused on only one thing: the truth. She stood before Darius and Monique with the confidence of a woman who understood the size of the storm they had unleashed. "The city is scrambling," she said, pacing. "Internal Affairs just announced an emergency inquiry. Subpoenas are being issued to officers tied to Daly. And I've already sent the footage to federal contacts." Monique sank into a chair, trembling. "Do we finally have leverage?" Clarissa's gaze sharpened. "Leverage," she repeated. "Monique, this isn't leverage. This is justice catching up to them. They attacked your family on camera. They sabotaged evidence. They concealed the history of stolen land. They hushed up murders and arson from the 1960s. Darius folded his arms. "What happens now?" Clarissa looked directly at him. "We take this public." Darius hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the weight such exposure would place on his family. "Clarissa, if we go public, it will protect you," she cut in. "Spotlights keep corrupt people from acting in the dark. The moment your story becomes national news, anyone targeting you will have the entire country watching. Monique reached for Darius's hand. She's right, she whispered. They attacked us because they thought we were alone. Let the world prove them wrong. That afternoon, a press conference was held outside City Hall. A crowd grew, neighbors, activists, journalists, and strangers who had seen the footage online and come to stand with the Colemans. When Darius stepped up to the microphone, the murmuring fell into reverent silence. He looked out at the sea of faces, black, white, Latino, Asian, young, old, families with children on their shoulders. People who understood that this wasn't just about one fight or one family. This was about truth. This was about history. This was about America's unfinished story with race and justice. He took a breath. My family came to Maple Ridge because we believed in the promise of this country. Safety, opportunity, community, a place where our daughter could grow without fear. Emotion tightened his throat, but he pressed on. What we found instead was a system built to keep people like us quiet. A system that made us afraid. A system that tried to erase not just our home, but a church, a community, and the lives lost on this land 60 years ago. Reporters typed. Cameras flashed. People nodded fiercely. Darius continued, voice resonant. I defended my family because the people who call themselves protectors became our attackers. I defended my wife because they tried to dehumanize her. I defended my daughter because they tried to break her spirit. His voice sharpened. But understand this. We are not running. A cheer rose. We are not hiding. Another wave of applause. And we are not alone. The crowd erupted. For the first time since the nightmare began, Darius saw what resistance truly looked like. Not guns, not violence, not fear, but community, solidarity, truth refusing to stay buried. He stepped back, letting Clarissa speak next, outlining the legal battles ahead, the federal investigations now underway, the verified history of the church burning, and the land theft. People listened with wide eyes and tight jaws. Some cried openly. Even the reporters struggled to maintain composure. Pain has a way of pulling people apart. Truth, real truth, has a way of pulling them together. Later that evening, when Darius returned home, dozens of neighbors were waiting. Black families who had once felt isolated. White families who admitted they'd been silent too long. Teenagers holding signs that read, "Justice for the Coleman's truth can't be burned down in racist corruption." Now Darius stood on his porch, his battered, cracked porch, and watched the crowd like a man witnessing a miracle grow from ashes. Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward first, her voice trembling. This land tried to swallow people whole, she said. But you, your family, made it speak again. You gave our ancestors their voices back. Tears streaked down Monique's cheeks. Lena squeezed her father's hand. Darius looked out at the people gathered. I didn't do this alone, he said softly. We did. A ripple of warmth moved through the crowd, a shared breath, a shared truth, a shared vision of an America that could be better than its past. Better because people stood up. Better because people fought back. Better because love refused to surrender. And for the first time since moving into Maple Ridge, the Colemans truly felt at home. Truth, fire, and a new America. The night smelled of rain, heavy, metallic, and full of warning. As the Colemans slept restlessly, the storm outside grew. Wind hammered the siding, streetlights flickered, the branches of the old oak tree groaned under the weight of the coming tempest. It was almost symbolic, Darius thought, when he jolted awake, like the sky itself was bracing for what the morning would bring. He slipped from bed quietly. Monique stirred but didn't wake. Down the hallway, Lena's nightlight glowed softly, painting constellations across her sleeping face. He lingered for a moment. Every fight he had endured since moving here, every bruise, every threat, every shard of glass, none of it had hurt as much as seeing fear etched into his daughter's eyes. He whispered a silent promise. I will finish this. I will end this cycle. I will not let this land hurt you the way it hurt the families who stood on it before us. Then he headed downstairs, where the storm waited. Clarissa's voice crackled through the speakerphone as he poured himself coffee. "We need to move today," she said without preamble. "The city council is voting on an emergency resolution that could strip your property rights under a redevelopment clause." Darius froze. "They're still trying to take the land?" "They're desperate," Clarissa replied. "Your story exposed them. But exposure and justice aren't the same thing. They want this nightmare to disappear before the feds tear into them." "What's the plan?" Darius asked. "Simple," Clarissa said. "We take the fight to them. Publicly. Openly. Together." He nodded. "We'll be ready." But before he hung up, Clarissa added one more thing, her voice quieter, heavier. "Be careful today, Darius. People who feel exposed don't act rationally." He didn't need the warning. He'd lived enough years to know what wounded power did when cornered. By mid-morning, the Colemans stepped outside to find a crowd gathered again. Not in protest, but in solidarity. Dozens of neighbors, many holding umbrellas against the drizzle, lined the street. Signs read, "We stand with the Colemans, accountability now, our neighbor, our friend, our fight." The moment Lena saw them, her posture softened. Some children from her school held handmade posters for her. "You're brave, Lena. We believe you. Your family matters." Tears stung Monique's eyes. For the first time, the community wasn't just witnessing their struggle. They were lifting it. Darius stepped through the crowd, shaking hands, offering gratitude. His strength came not from his military training, but from the people who had begun to see him as more than a man caught in conflict. They saw him as a symbol, a mirror, a voice they had needed. City Hall loomed ahead, an imposing building of stone and glass, polished to reflect an image of authority that now felt hollow to the Colemans. Inside the council chamber, tension hung thick enough to choke. TV crews lined the back wall. Reporters whispered predictions. Citizens filled every bench. Police officers, some uneasy, some resentful, lined the perimeter. And at the long elevated dais sat the council members, faces carved into masks of forced neutrality. Councilman Davidson sat in the center, the architect of the redevelopment scheme, fingers steepled, jaw clenched. He looked like a man holding a match over a pool of gasoline. Clarissa approached the podium first. "Members of the council," she began, voice calm but edged with steel. "We are here today not simply to oppose a redevelopment proposal. We are here to expose the truth about how this land, now occupied by the Coleman family, was obtained through criminal acts, racial terror, and decades of corruption." Murmurs rippled through the room. Davidson scoffed. "Ms. James, these accusations are irresponsible." "Sit down," Clarissa said sharply. Gasps erupted. Even Darius blinked. But Davidson froze. Clarissa continued. "I have documented evidence showing officials from this very city ordered the destruction of Starlight Baptist Church in 1964. I have testimonies from descendants. I have financial records linking your redevelopment plan to a deliberate effort to hide the truth." Whispers filled the chamber. A councilwoman leaned toward Davidson. "Is this true?" Davidson's face hardened. "This is misinformation, a smear campaign orchestrated by—" Darius rose. When he spoke, the room fell silent. "We are not here because of a smear campaign," he said. "We are here because the truth survived, despite everything you did to bury it." Davidson glared. "Your family attacked law enforcement, Mr. Coleman. You are not a hero." "No," Darius said quietly. "I'm a father, a husband, a man standing on land built over broken stories and broken bones, the same land you plan to steal again." He stepped forward, the weight of every injustice pressing behind him. "You came after us because we were an obstacle. You tried to frame me because you needed us gone. You used the police because you knew the badge would intimidate. But you forgot one thing." Davidson sneered. "And what is that?" "You forgot that the truth has a heartbeat." Monique stood beside him now. Lena too. Clarissa projected onto the screens behind them the footage of the ambush, the masked officers attacking, the punches, the kicks, the attempted execution. A collective gasp filled the room. Then Clarissa played the racist threats captured earlier. Then the recordings from the police radio. Then the evidence of land theft. Davidson's face drained of color. Council members exchanged horrified glances. The crowd's whispers grew into outrage. "How many years?" They hid all that? This is unbelievable. Finally, Clarissa delivered the decisive blow. Federal prosecutors have reviewed this case, she announced. They are issuing warrants today for the arrest of multiple officers, including former Sergeant Brian Daly, and several city officials tied to the 1964 church arson and its subsequent cover-up. The room exploded. Reporters rushed forward. Camera flashes strobed. Davidson lunged to stand, only for two federal agents to approach him. "Councilman Davidson," one agent said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, falsification of public records, and participation in racially motivated acts of terror." "You can't arrest me," Davidson shouted. "This is political." His words died as the agents cuffed him. The chamber broke into cheers. Tears streaked Monique's face. Darius felt a weight lift slowly, like a stone he had carried his entire life. Lena clapped through her tears, whispering, "Daddy, they're finally gone." Later that afternoon, the sunlight broke through the clouds as federal cruisers streamed out of City Hall. Officers, developers, and council members, handcuffed, silent, were loaded into vans. The city watched from the sidewalks. Some stood stunned, some stood vindicated, some stood weeping. And then something beautiful happened. People began approaching the Colemans, not with pity, but with reverence. A woman hugged Monique. "You saved the city." A teenager fist-bumped Darius. "You're a legend, sir." A small boy handed Lena a drawing of a heart and said, "You're the bravest girl in school." The wind carried a new kind of sound. Not fear, not anger, but hope. A hope carved from pain and truth and perseverance. That evening, the Colemans returned home. For the first time, stepping across the threshold didn't feel like stepping into danger. It felt like stepping into legacy. As they entered, they found something unexpected on their porch. A wooden plaque carved by hand. Mrs. Jenkins must have left it. It read, "This house stands for the ones who couldn't. This family speaks for those who were silenced. This land remembers, and now it heals." Monique covered her mouth, tears spilling over. Lena traced the letters gently. "This is for us?" "For us," Darius whispered, "and for everyone who came before us." He lifted the plaque and held it to his chest. Then he looked at his family, his reasons for fighting, and felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude. Not for victory, not for vindication, but for the love that held them together when the world tried to tear them apart. They sat together in the living room, the broken window temporarily boarded, the lights dim, the quiet peaceful. Monique rested her head on Darius's shoulder. "Are we safe now?" she whispered. Darius kissed her forehead. "For the first time," he murmured, "I think we just might be." Lena curled into his other side. "Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Is everything going to be better now?" Darius thought about the land outside, the church that once stood in its place, the people who had worshipped there, and the generations whose voices had been stolen. He thought about the corrupt officers arrested today, the councilmen exposed, the community awakened. He thought about America, flawed, painful, struggling, but still capable of something extraordinary. He pulled Lena closer. "It will be," he said softly. "Not because it's easy, but because people are choosing to make it better." He looked toward the window, toward the street where strangers had become protectors, where hidden history had been resurrected, where love had outmatched fear. "That's how we build a stronger America," he whispered, "one truth at a time." The storm outside had passed, but a new dawn was rising, a dawn built on courage, on unity, on justice, on the belief that even the darkest chapters of history can be rewritten, not erased, but redeemed. And in that moment, in the quiet of their healing home, the Colemans knew they were no longer fighting alone. They were part of a movement, and the movement had only just begun. Stories like this one remind us of something deep, something ancient, something undeniably true. A home is not just a structure. A family is not just a group of people. And America is not just a place. America is a promise that every single person, no matter their race, their size, their background, or their story, deserves dignity, safety, and the right to live free from fear. The Coleman family showed us something powerful. Real strength isn't measured by combat skill or physical toughness. Real strength is the love that refuses to surrender. Real strength is a father who will walk through fire for his daughter. Real strength is a mother who stands tall despite the storms. Real strength is a community that wakes up, steps forward and says, "Not here, not anymore, not to our neighbors." This story is not just about corruption being exposed. It's about hope being restored. It's about truth rising after decades of silence. It's about ordinary people choosing to care, choosing to speak up, choosing to rebuild the very idea of what America can be. Because the lesson is bigger than the violence, bigger than the injustice, bigger than the pain. The lesson is this: when we stand together, no one can be erased. When we love one another, no hate can win. And when we fight for justice, we make America stronger. Not for some, but for all. What happened to the Colemans should never happen to any family. And it won't if we decide right now to be the generation that refuses discrimination, refuses silence, and refuses division. So let this story stay with you. Let it remind you that your voice matters, your compassion matters, your courage matters, and your willingness to help someone different from you. That is the foundation of a better country, a stronger America, an America where truth is not buried, where neighbors protect neighbors, and where no child grows up fearing the world outside their front door. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, if it strengthened your heart, then please subscribe to the Racial Truth Channel. This channel exists to shine light into dark places, to tell stories that challenge, stories that heal, stories that remind us what humanity looks like at its best and what we must confront at its worst. Don't stop here. Visit the channel, watch more stories, share them. Let's keep learning together. Let's keep growing together. Let's keep building a stronger, kinder, more united America, one story at a time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of this journey toward justice, truth, and love. See you in the next video.